Hello and welcome to a very special end-of-year Downstream where I am delighted to be joined by my colleagues, my comrades, my bad influences, Michael Walker and Aaron Bastani. How are you both doing?
Very well, mate. Very well. Just finished the Novara live, so I'm hoping I can keep myself together.
Have another Pro Plus.
It's too late for a Pro. I had two before we went live.
Okay, all right. That is real Pro Plus. It's not a, media euphemism for anything. Before we get started, the first thing that I want to say is that we are currently running a fundraiser. So I'm personally really proud of the work that we've put out this year. We've launched new products like If I Speak. I think that the quality of Novara Live has gone up. We've managed to pay really close attention to stories, whether it's the ongoing genocide in Gaza or a firm commitment to looking at the economic foundation of this country and not getting distracted by what Laura Kuenssberg has to say. I'm really proud of that work, but it's only possible because of your support. So what we're asking for is that you donate the equivalent of 1 hour's worth of your wage per month. Go to novara.media/support, and we'll continue working around the clock to bring you the news and analysis that you just won't get anywhere else. So for today's end of year roundup, a lot has happened. We have had some seismic elections, both here and in the United States. You've had huge shifts in geopolitics. You've had massive cultural trends. There's no way, even if I wanted to, and I kept you locked in here all night, that we could get through it all. So instead, what I've tried to do is pull together some questions which I think bring together a lot of the big themes from this year. So hopefully we'll cover most of the important stuff, if not all of it. And this also gives you both the freedom to bring in whatever you like in terms of what you think the most significant events were of 2024. So my first question, and maybe I'll throw to you first, Aaron, because I know that you've been looking at some polling. How stable is this Labour government? So, of course, they swept in on the back of a landslide, a parliamentary landslide, if not a popular vote landslide, in July. And already they're polling behind the Conservatives and Reform in one poll. So how stable are they?
So we've got Mr. Sensible over here, Michael Walker. If I say anything too hyperbolic, he'll sort of course correct and say, well, I don't know about that. But the polling we're seeing within 6 months of a general election is unprecedented. And that doesn't just apply to the top two parties, because very often you have a new government becomes very unpopular very quickly. You can look at Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s. You can look at Ed Miliband outpolling the Tories after 2010. That's not unusual. Tony Blair had really strong poll leads for actually quite a long time, but he still had political crises like the fuel protests, right, in 97. This is really different in so much as the structure of voting intention is radically different to what we've seen before. There was one poll out recently, and again, polls can be wrong, right? When Donald Trump went on Joe Rogan and said that he thinks like most polls are made up, probably true, right? certainly when it comes to...
Wait, can you do it in the Trump voice?
Look, I won't do it because I'm also personally unwell at the moment. I'm quite sick, so it's a struggle at the best of times. But he was saying that most of them are made up, and I think with the presidential election, I think actually they aren't particularly reliable. I think Westminster polling slightly better, but with these conditions at the moment, I think maybe there is more margin of error than usually. Why am I saying that? Because one poll in particular had, I think, the Greens on 9, then you have the Lib Dems. You have Reform, the Tories, Labour. You have 5 parties. They were between 9% and 26%. That's not meant to happen in a first-past-the-post system. So you could potentially see 5 parties between 10 and 30, let's say. Let's say that's the ultimate range, but even 9 to 26. That's never happened before. And then, of course, you've got the geographical concentration of the SNP, at which point predictions become quite hard. Now, we're quite lucky in this country because we've got MRP polling at constituency level. So I think, polls ahead of the next general election probably will be quite robust. But in terms of predicting who then forms a government, that becomes really hard because actually, if that was correct, that particular poll, there isn't a majority, whether that's Reform and the Tories or whether that's Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens and even the SNP, at which point you'd have to have another general election. So we have in this country an electoral system which is designed, if nothing else, to create majorities. And politics right now is so fragmented, even first past the post might not do that. So yes, there's a crisis of legitimacy for the Labour Party, but it goes beyond that. In that poll, I think the Tories were top with 26%. Now, you might be a Tory and think, wow, we're going to come first in the vote share. Well, still by vote share, that's their second worst result since the 1830s. That tells you about the scale of the crisis of confidence in electoral politics more generally.
I mean, I guess I want to turn to you because, you know, hosting Novara Live, like you're looking at Labour stories every single day. And I suppose there's
I try not to now.
Well, you try not to. But like, you know, most days there'll be at least one. There'll be something that the government's done. And there might be a tendency, particularly in left-wing circles, to look at everything through the lens of what you want to see. So it's always, Keir Starmer's fucked it. Like, this is going to kill them, da-da-da-da-da. I suppose something like winter fuel allowance, which, you know, does seem to be hurting them politically. You know, how important do you think that's going to be when it comes to Labour contesting local elections, obviously much sooner, and then obviously going into the next general election? Do you think that people are going to remember that kind of pain?
I mean, I think Keir Starmer isn't very good at politics. I think clearly the biggest error they have made up to this point was the winter fuel payments. But one thing you could say about Labour when they were in opposition is they seemed disciplined, right? Morgan McSweeney seemed like he had one thing on his mind, which is we are going to get elected. And you can also, you know, read his attacks on the left in a sort of sympathetic light. Was he saying, you know, for whatever reason, Corbynism was quite unpopular. He believed you could only get a majority if you distanced yourself from it, and proactively distancing yourself from it maybe was, you know, a decent electoral move. But you can only really be sympathetic towards it if it's in aid of something. And I suppose it does seem like maybe it was an end in and of itself, because they've got into government and they seem to have no idea what to do. And if you were disciplined in terms of we are going to do whatever it takes to get re-elected, you wouldn't go after pensioners for £1 billion.
Because they vote.
Which is what they did. They vote. There's loads of them, right? And they vote in sort of key seats. You know, the Labour Party had this sort of hero voter phrase, which they went over to America and told Kamala Harris about.
Yeah, it really
was
works
supposed
for
to be people who are sort of somewhere in between the Tories and Labour, maybe a little bit economically left-wing, socially right-wing, or socially conservative, however you want to frame it. And they're who we have to be, in Keir Starmer's words, in our mind's eye all the time. And then you take away the winter fuel payment, which, I mean, it does seem to me that they have erred. I was thinking as well this morning, sort of looking at the notes. If you think about, you know, you don't want to get too bogged down in character, but I do think it does matter. And if you think about who are the politicians who've won 2 general elections in this country in recent memory, Thatcher, Blair, Cameron, both people who could, you know, when you listen to them talk, they felt confident, they felt natural. You could see how they were sort of dominating the political scene. The ones who didn't win 2 general elections, John Major, Gordon Brown, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak. I'm going to leave out Boris Johnson because I think he's somewhat sui generis. And who does Keir Starmer seem more like, right? He is not the kind of guy who can dominate the political scene. And I think to sort of be a successful government and get re-elected at the end of it, you need a little bit of charisma, and he doesn't have it.
I mean, there was something that Patrick Maguire wrote about in the Times just last week, because you've had this thing of like, you know, the 3 foundations, then the 5 missions, and then the 6 first steps, and now the 6 milestones. And Patrick Maguire called it a rambling meta commentary. So it's always, I'm going to do it like this, and this is going to be the measures of the thing. It's not what the thing is. And you compare that to the sort of laser-like focus of Boris Johnson on Get Brexit Done, or, you know, the kind of like bigger story of like grievance and resentment that Donald Trump is able to tap into. And I just look at Keir Starmer and I go, I don't really know who your us is and who your them is. And I don't really understand how his priorities are being shaped. He seems to really enjoy being on the international stage. He loves jetting off to do sort of like confabs with heads of government. I wonder if Rachel Reeves has sort of taken up a bit more and a bit more of the domestic agenda, and she's a bit of a bean counter. So she's looking at it as like, £1 billion, great, rather than the overall political story.
There's a clip, we showed it on Novara Live, which I'm surprised hasn't been circulated more, which is her in 2014 when she was shadow Secretary for Work and Pensions in Parliament, criticising a Tory budget then, or a coalition budget, for saying the Labour Party would means test the winter fuel allowance. And so, you know, because they've tried to say we didn't want to do this, we've had to do this because of this huge black hole in the finances that the Tory party have left. I'm surprised the Tories aren't sort of paying for loads of adverts for that to be pushed out, because she's on record saying she wanted to do it. She's wanted to do this for 10 years.
Well, the Tory attack operation isn't what it was.
True.
I remember speaking to a senior Tory advisor before the last general election, and they were saying, we can't really lay a glove on Rachel Reeves. And I was like, she had a parliamentary credit card, which she refused, she forgot to pay. There was a couple of MPs who basically maxed out their credit card, and she was one of them. And you think, well, this person's going to be in charge of the national budget. That would be a classic Lindsay Crosby attack line. He was like, wow, I've never heard that before. That's crazy. So on the point you made a moment ago, Ash, I don't know Keir Starmer's us, no. I don't know his them. I don't know his objectives, and I don't know his theory of change. The theory of change point's really important because we had Sue Gray come in as his chief of staff because the theory of change apparently was we need an insider within the civil service in order to achieve the things we want to achieve, right? We're going from opposition to government. And within 6 months, Keir Starmer is giving a speech, having gotten rid of Sue Gray, attacking the civil service. There was this weird sort of, crypto Dominic Cummings style rhetoric. So to go from Sue Gray, who was the personification of everything Dominic Cummings was attacking within the civil service, to basically Dominic Cummings, by the way, tweeting parts of the speech going, "This is really good. Maybe Starmer gets it." To go from one to the other, I think if I was a Starmer supporter, like a fan, I'd be really worried because I'd be like, wow, they really are flying blind. There is no compass here. And that would worry me, I think, more than anything else. Because the objectives, you can work those out, the us and the them, that can, if you're a good leftist, you say that's formed during the process of struggle. But if you literally don't know how you're going to change stuff, I think then you're really screwed.
How worried should Labour be about reform? Because I've got a little tidbit of gossip for both of you, which is a friend of mine who's staying with me was at the launch of a Unison report, I believe it was yesterday. And who was there? None other than Richard Tice, who's, of course, a Reform MP, formerly their leader before he did the old switcheroo with Nigel Farage. And actually, a couple of years ago, Richard Tice met up with me. He wanted to meet with me to just talk about politics. And I was really confused by it, but obviously I kind of went to hear him out, and he was like, some of the things that we're into might surprise you, I didn't put much store in it at the time. What this is maybe indicating to me is that Reform understand that if you want to win from the far right, you should tilt left economically a bit. And I think they're doing a bit of sounding out for some ideas. In order to sort of, collect that really, big cohort of voters who are out there who, lean left economically, lean right socially. So that's the gossip. But the question is how worried should Labour be about reform?
Well, I suppose on one level, on a very base sort of level, I suppose, to say level twice. I was trying to think of the second word, but I didn't manage it. You've got...
Need more Pro Plus.
Yeah, need more Pro Plus. You, like electoral strategists in the Labour Party might be thinking, well, the better Reform are doing, the lower the vote share we need to get a majority, because it means the right-wing vote is split between Reform and the Tory party, and maybe then they can have another loveless landslide. I think politically, all of us, the way we're talking about Keir Starmer sort of being, rudderless and not seeming very effective. I don't say that with glee, because I think if this Labour Party fails, I don't see it sort of being something to the left that swoops in and takes over the country. I think if Keir Starmer fails, it's going to be Reform and the Conservatives. And I think Keir Starmer should be very worried about Reform and the Conservatives. If they were to make any kind of alliance at the next general election, they would win, I think. So, yeah, he should be worried about them. Although I do think that there will be some short-sighted people, within his team saying, the more we talk about immigration, the more that becomes salient. People really hate the Conservative Party over that, because this is going to be a really big deal over the next 5 years. That the year before the Tories left office, net migration was 1 million, right? They are not going to be able to land a blow on the Labour Party on that particular issue, which means that Labour might not mind it becoming more salient. They think that will split the right-wing vote. Where that takes our politics is a different question.
What do you reckon?
I think if Robert Jenrick was the leader of the Conservative Party, I would actually say I think it's probable that there would be some kind of Tory reform government. I think Kemi Badenoch being so central to that moment of the Boris wave of immigration, I don't think Farage wants that, to be associated with his political brand, actually. And one line of attack which hasn't really been launched at Farage is, you stood down all these candidates, which is what Ben Habib attacks him over. You stood down all these candidates in 2019. You gave Boris this massive majority, and then we get circa 2.5 million people in 4 years migrating to the UK, net migration. I think 1.7 million in 2 years. Over 4 years, it's I think 2.3, something like that. And there is a line of attack from Farage's right, which is, you gave this man the majority to oversee unprecedented levels of migration, and you're saying you're going to do something about it. And I think Farage probably has that in the back of his mind. Does he want to do that again? He almost blew his political credibility by backing Boris the way that he did. Does he want to do that again? I don't know. We can talk about that over the course of the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes, or whatever. What I would say is this. The party which has the most to lose from reform, I think, are the Conservatives. Right? Even if they do go into government with reform, I think reform want to replace the Conservative Party. That's Farage's aim. And that's the reason why he's being quite, conciliatory, and he's trying to be quite grown up. And, you've got these people on social media saying, we need mass deportations. He's going, no, I'm a civic nationalist. He's saying the things he needs to say to win over maybe a Tory Lib Dem swing voter who watches Country File once a month. He wants that person to think, I quite like Nigel Farage. There was that election video ahead of the general election when, he announced that he was going to stand, and he was in the Kent countryside with his, his Labrador and his Barber fleece gilet looking at apple trees. That's the image he's trying to project, right? Family man, safe, stable, and ultimately I think that means that he's coming for the Conservative Party's lunch. And in terms of, you were saying about the fuel allowance a moment ago, it's almost like the Labour Party is trying to radicalise the country's petty bourgeois as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And by the way, that is going to be the core vote for reform going forward. Petty bourgeois, small business owners, retirees who, have, maybe a large ISA, maybe a buy-to-let property. These are the people...
Self-employed, doing well for themselves, tradespeople.
Yeah. And I think between the national insurance hike on employers, the winter fuel allowance gives them a sense of self-righteousness, inheritance tax reforms to farmers, and then all the cultural stuff. It's almost like Labour is trying to accelerate this process of radicalising the petty bourgeois. I say this time after time, but Dan Evans' formulation of Trumpism is, we are family capital versus national global capital. And I think Farage is alive to that tension, and Farage is saying, I want to represent family capital. Labour, the party of BlackRock. Right, so I think that ultimately you need to be realistic. Reform is going after the Tory party, although of course they are going to also want a lot of Labour voters.
I mean, I suppose the last thing I want to raise with regards to this Labour government is the August riots. So that was, I mean, for me it was both shocking and not shocking to experience it and to witness it. It was shocking in terms of the scale of the violence, in particular the targeting of asylum seekers and people who were just ethnic minorities. I mean, that's obviously a shocking thing to see. Also not shocking in the sense of when you have a politics which is so committed to demonizing asylum seekers, ultimately, if you're being told that these people are, swamping the country, invading these shores, they want to do nothing but kind of, rape and pillage, well, you make violence, if not inevitable, a lot more likely. So in that sense, it wasn't surprising to me. What maybe was a bit more surprising to me is that Keir Starmer, though he was not inspiring, I don't think that he sort of sold a message or a vision for the country at all. I don't think that he was convincing in his rejection of, this kind of violent, vicious racism. Ultimately, he had quite a good riots. Do you know what I mean? Like it didn't hurt him as much as I thought it might. And there was the attempt to fashion an attack line by parts of the right, two-tier Keir, this idea that people of colour are treated more preferentially by the police and criminal justice system, which is kind of funny. But that doesn't necessarily seem to have stuck. I mean, what do you think? Like, do you think that Keir Starmer had a good riots? Do you think it could come back to haunt him in some way?
In terms of what he did exactly what I would have expected him to do, which was be in sort of his comfort zone, and I assume sort of Morgan McSweeney's comfort zone, which is stay away from the issue of immigration and say this is a law and order issue and these people are law-breaking thugs. In terms of how it will play for him in future, I mean, I suppose on the right, you are getting sort of lots of people who are sort of saying these people who've gone to prison for tweets, this is not necessarily two-tier in the sense that white people and black people get treated differently, but violent crime is treated less seriously than crimes against sort of manners or offensiveness.
Yeah, sure. It's just that the tweets were like burn down the hotel with asylum seekers.
I think most of it's ridiculous and silly, but that seems to be present. Whether or not any of those people were swing voters who might have voted for Labour is a different question. I think they probably weren't. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it will come back to haunt him because he played it safe. I mean, I don't think he would have won any voters during that period, but I think it was neutral for him, I suppose.
I guess I could kind of, I was trying to think about if this had happened under Tony Blair, I could imagine him in his shirt sleeves. Do you know what I mean? Like kind of staring down the barrel of the camera, giving it the big one over some vision of the country. Yeah. And that felt conspicuously absent from Keir Starmer at that moment.
Well, that's true, but I would say in response, every single political problem which has beset this government since July, every single major problem, has been self-inflicted.
Including the riots?
Well, the riots weren't obviously, but I agree with you, there was no real political overhead for the riots, and they obviously didn't cause the riots. But if you look at all of the things which I think created a major issue with the public, whether that's policy choices on things like the winter fuel allowance, whether it's the optics of taking expenses whilst in government, every single misstep that I think has cost them politically, every single one has been self-inflicted. I can't think of something where actually it was a really great line of attack generated by the opposition or the media, which obviously that happens to Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, constantly. That hasn't happened to them yet, and it will, by the way, because of course it happens to governments in an election year. Everything has been self-inflicted, which is just extraordinary when you think about it.
I mean, I think to be this rudderless on such a big majority feels quite significant. You'd expect that there would be a sense of stability and confidence. It's like, okay, we can do what we want. We can get anything we like through the Commons.
I mean, the budget wasn't that bad. I don't. That's why I don't want the downfall of this Labour government. Really, I don't think it would be replaced by anything better. I kind of want them to be a success. And, the budget was fine. It was a fairly bog standard social democratic budget. I think they raised taxes across the board to fund public services, and they changed the debt rules so that they can invest in infrastructure. I mean, it was, it wasn't amazing, but it was fine. It was a lot better than what a Tory budget would have been. So, on some of the technocratic stuff, we'll have to wait and see. They'll probably argue that, if we can raise living standards in 4 or 5 years' time, everyone will have forgotten about the winter fuel payments, which isn't completely unreasonable. That might be true. But I mean, you're right. You shouldn't, in the meantime, create all of these self-inflicted wounds, which are alienating really key constituencies who would get you over the line the next time around.
I mean, did you guys see the Liz Kendall story?
No, what was this?
About a week ago. So obviously Labour have taken the winter fuel allowance away from 10 million people. By the way, I think that was a misstep in itself. You should have just initially taken it away from a few million people, see how that goes down, and just edge. I would have done that, personally. Anyway, Labour have taken the winter fuel allowance away from 10 million people. It's just now with 2 million of the original 12. Liz Kendall lives in a £4 million property in Notting Hill with her financier partner. She is on £91,000 a year as an MP. I think on top of that, she gets circa £40,000 a year because she's in the cabinet. So she's on about £130,000 a year gross. Obviously, her partner's very wealthy. They live in a really nice place, in a very affluent part of London. And the taxpayer was paying thousands of pounds a year to pay for her energy bills. And I just think if I was the PM or if I was Morgan McSweeney, I would just be on the phone to them and say, are you fucking stupid? Do you want us to lose the next general election? Because even if there wasn't the winter fuel allowance crisis happening, that's awful. But to say that a pensioner, one of the edge cases, which by the way, they do exist.
Oh, loads of them.
Yeah.
Loads of them.
No, but there are some people who are spending the winter fuel allowance on like their Christmas wine collection. I get it. But there are people who absolutely weren't doing that. Even if that wasn't a live issue, we've got the media coming after us in a way that has not been the case previously. And this is a separate point I'll raise this quickly. I think people like Liz Kendall, I think lots of MPs think that the media environment is the same as 30 years ago. Oh, the BBC will give us a fair crack of the whip. Yeah, the tabloids don't like us, but, whatever. We've got, No, you've now got GB News, right? You now have GB News, which is a very successful news network. They've overtaken Sky for the first time in terms of monthly views. And you've got X, which is owned by Elon Musk. And it's such a huge shift in the media environment. And if you think that, it's just going to be like, the early noughties where you can get away with little things like this, think again.
So I will want to move us on. And the next question in my list is this. Is 2024 the year that woke died? Now, I've got a lot of thoughts on this.
Go on, you go first, Ash.
Yeah,
You're the smartest of the three.
We'll go first on this topic.
Okay. So I think that you've got to get a little bit into what woke means. For me, what woke means is a set of social values and politics which are more to do with culture than the economy, and has a focus on things like language, makes a virtue out of minority statuses, and I think has an approach to advancing that set of values and politics, not through persuasion, but through kind of creating a social code where if people fall foul of it, they're, labelled in a particular way.
Surely not.
Labelled in a particular way. Even before Trump's electoral victory, where he won both the popular vote and the electoral college and made gains amongst basically everybody, including people of colour. Even before that happened, I was thinking a lot about this very individualistic, very guilt-laden way of seeing anti-racism, feminism, the cause for trans rights, so on and so forth. And I write about that in the first chapter of my book, which is coming out in February. And the place I start is that I was at a really big left-wing gathering, and it became so dominated by people who literally wanted the conversation and the political project to stop because they felt harmed by use of language. And it was a use of language which, while uncouth, was not racialized, was not transphobic, wasn't nothing. It was that somebody used the word cunt. And then you had a room full of adults being like, you've brought violence into this space. And that for me was like a moment of like, this has gone too far. And I think that while this happened on a relatively marginal bit of political culture, I think that you do find it fairly dominant in spaces where you've got lots of liberal leaning graduates, and it's very dominant within the NGO sector. I think that it's something which is crossed over into the world of corporations. It's an easy way for corporations to signal themselves to particular kinds of customers, and they also, I think, get it wrong. You saw it with the Jaguar advert, which is essentially because they got totally fucked by the government's new rules on producing electric vehicles. They were having to reorient themselves in the production of their cars. So they kind of did this thing of like, hey, what about if Jaguar was like electric vehicles, kind of exclusive and a bit non-binary? And that last bit was like, what? like what? What do you mean? I
kind of love it though. like non-binary EVs.
What? And that was a moment where I think even people who are like very, very pro-trans, very, very progressive, were like, this is a completely hollow and self-destructive form of politics. Like, you as a corporation have tried to make people angry by doing this, by putting kind of, gender non-conforming people front and center. Why are you doing it? You're doing it to flog cars. And so I think that moment of very, very liberal identity politics, a way of sort of trying to leverage social shaming to get it through, and also, within the workplace, kind of like war by HR. I do think that that's dying. It's not dying easy, but I think it is dying. And while I don't like the cruelty and the sort of gleeful obnoxiousness that you see on parts of the right, where it's like, I really want to say the N word and I want to call you whatever name I want to call you. I think that's disgusting. I think that culture of like weaponized victimhood, of like the imposition of language and an obsession with language, which I think is particularly an outgrowth of like, you know, arts and humanities grads, because you're trained to think about nothing but language all the time. I think that being on its way out is a good thing.
I think there's a couple. I mean, I think it's on its way out. I'd say sort of two developments. Sort of one is just sort of the passage of time, to sound a bit like Kamala Harris, which is sort of lots of wokeness, I think, was inside organizations. And it sort of started from sort of legitimate grievances that people might have had. And then it comes along with certain, let's say, sort of ideologies or ideas, which people high up in organizations don't necessarily agree with, but they think, fine, you know, I don't want to have an argument, go for that.
Better you do this than unionize.
Exactly. They bring in DEI and everything like that. It's a bigger deal in America, I think, than here. And I think that's often created fairly toxic work environments that people don't really like. And now people are saying, oh, maybe that was a mistake. We're going to take a few steps back from that. I think Donald Trump's election is really, really significant second time around. The first time, people could sort of say it was an accident. And in many ways, it was a bit of an accident. This time around, clearly people knew who they were voting for. And I think it's really, really significant that the way we've talked about Donald Trump and the way sort of liberal people in general talk about Donald Trump is that he is an exceptionally offensive president, or a candidate beforehand, an exceptionally offensive candidate, an exceptionally racist candidate would be sort of one of the most obvious charges against him. Yet he is the Republican presidential candidate in this century who has attracted the largest number of Latinos and Black voters. Now, if we have been talking, if our model...
Cities generally, right, as well, which is not talked about, but just cities.
If our model of racism is something where the guy who we think is the most racist guy ever actually is he's still not getting a majority of Black voters. I think Latinos, it's about 50-50 at this point in time. But if he can get more voters of color than any other Republican this century, then our concept of racism has gone wrong, I think. Because the only people actually who have shifted away from the Republicans in that period of time are graduates. So we've got this model of racism which offends graduates of all races, but doesn't seem to bother non-graduates of ethnic minority heritage. So it seems like something's gone wrong there.
It bothers them less than other things.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's also this issue of, I think one other part of wokeness, which we haven't necessarily sort of covered, although I suppose you did mention it, is the tendency to argue from identity. So you argue your favoured border policy or whatever, you're not necessarily sort of having a rational debate about the pros and cons. You're saying to disagree with this is anti-Latino, or a conversation about police reform. If you don't want to defund the police, that's anti-Black. And it turns out that actually Latinos and Black people kind of vote, similarly to other people, right? They also want to feel safe in their communities and think that the police are going to provide that to some extent. Obviously, they want reform. They don't want to be shooting people. But they have these opinions which normies of all races have, which is we want cops. We don't want a completely uncontrolled border. And so I think that tendency to argue from identity and on behalf of an identity group has now just been shown to be, I don't want to use too harsh a word, but sort of its flaws have become very apparent, let's say.
I think there's something in it. And I wonder what you think about this, which is also a tendency, I think, amongst, progressives to take the most marginal edge case and to sort of like put it right at the top of like the priorities tree, right? Say that this person is the most vulnerable, therefore they've got to go right up here. And I can understand why morally you might want to do that. However, politically, and politics is always a game of numbers if you're contesting elections, well, that person is not very representative of lots of people's experiences. And so if you want to talk about, defunding the police, or if you want to talk about, having a much more permissive border policy, and you're saying, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to center it on the people who are like directly have experienced police violence, or people who are, undocumented migrants seeking asylum. I can see why you do that, and I can see why they've got a particular form of authority, but they do not have an experience which is representative of absolutely everybody within that racial or ethnic group. And I think that there's been a sort of slippage, right? Which is you go from like, okay, well, we're taking this person, we're putting them right at the top of the priorities tree, and like they get to set the agenda. And then they suddenly become a stand-in for all people of color. So that's how it goes from, okay, well, if you want a pro-Latino candidate, it's got to be the one that takes a sort of maximalist position around borders. Or if you want a candidate which is good for Black people, it's got to be defunding the police and not just reforming the police or something else. And it's just like, but that person does not mirror the experiences of the entire cohort. And so I think that there is, you know, for me, the big thing here is minoritarianism versus majoritarianism. And this isn't about giving up minority opinions. It's about having an orientation towards most people in your politics. That doesn't mean you have to say, I'm going to repeat back whatever I think most people want to hear, but understand that you're trying to persuade and move most people. And so if you're centered on the hyper-marginal edge case, you're going to lose. But I don't know what you think about that.
So on the woke stuff, I mean, I don't like woke politics. Now, let me clarify what I mean by that.
You say so many slurs in the office, Aaron. So many.
As a set of political commitments, if you want to make some claim in regards to policy, like, I don't care. You may be right. I'm very open to a very wide range of views, including police abolition, whatever, right? That's, you know, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the data, et cetera, et cetera. Even if it's unpopular ideas can still be correct. And with the passage of time, again, to borrow from Kamala Harris, they're proven to be right. So the policy commitments, whatever they may be, aren't the issue for me. The problem with woke politics is the style of politics. It's how you do the politics. So complete disinterest in persuasion, complete disinterest in a majoritarian politics, which, by the way, in democracy, you kind of need. Like you say, the standpoint epistemology. Well, this person is from this background, therefore they know more than you. Well, no, there are also these things called like objective facts, and we have data, and we can say, actually, we've got, you know, quantitative data which suggests that this person isn't entirely representative of the community they apparently do reflect. And I think as well, there is one point that's made by the right about the woke politics stuff, which is there's a sacralization of identity. And I think that's correct. You know, I think there is a sacralization going on with regards to gender, race, sexual orientation. And look, to some people, I'm a white cis man, I'm half Iranian, whatever, but I mean, I'm, you know, this time of year I'm racialized as white, fine. Maybe not in July or August. You know, so it's easy for me to say that. But, you know, the godmother, for instance, to my daughter, she's a trans woman. Fascinating, amazing woman. She cares, she's an activist. But there's so much to her, right? It's not just those particular features of them. And of course, she's very proud as a trans woman, and that's obviously impacts everything about her life. But you can have a conversation about a plethora of things. And I think, you know, sometimes I've been approached to write something or do something because I'm half Iranian. And I think, what are you talking about? I've got so many things I'm interested and fascinated in. The idea that I'm only going to write about something as a British Iranian, I mean, I personally find it quite revolting. And it's probably because I've been white passing for most of my life. I had the name Peters, which is a gentleman my mum was married to. So I was in a grammar school in Dorset. I lived that quintessential British sort of life, right? You know, primarily white place, Bournemouth in the 1980s and the 1990s. Not that many people of colour. So maybe I've got it wrong, and maybe it's my socialization talking, but this idea that we sacralize our identities, I think it's really dangerous. And by the way, if white majorities sacralize their identities, guess what happens?
Well, exactly. I mean, so the first thing is that I'm also white passing, and it's very racist of you to tell me that I'm not. But like, I think just on that is that I think that. And I'm using the term liberal identity politics deliberately because the origins of identity politics were deeply anti-capitalist. It was a different way of understanding it. I'm not saying it was all good, but I'm just saying that it was different. It was much less centered around universities and much less centered around language. But liberal identity politics, which is the sort of focus on the individual identity and the whole speaking as a thing, is that you don't just get to play that game, all right? Your opponents will find a way to play that game and find a way to play it better than you. So one is the use of weaponized grievance and a kind of sacralization of identity. You do see the right do that. And I do think that, the use of the term white working class, which is the only time that the right talk about class, by the way, they don't talk about class in any other context apart from the white working class.
So true.
When
did they say white middle class? The white middle class.
Never fucking do it. And they don't talk about the black working class, right? Suddenly it's like, black people, Asian people, white working class, right? It's a way of turning class politics into ethnic politics. Because why? Talking about ethnic groups is smaller than talking about class groups. It's a way of breaking people down into minority statuses. The reason why they do that is because minority statuses are not powerful, right? They are numerically weaker. But the right do that, and I think they do that with the way of segmenting off white working class. That's not to say that I don't think that there are differences in the experience of class and the experience of deprivation, which are kind of, mitigated and changed by ethnicity. I think that's true. But it's a way of understanding it. It's like an ethnic thing. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that I think you see that weaponization of victimhood and a weaponization of identity when it comes to the genocide in Gaza and how pro-Israel advocacy groups weaponize Jewish fear. And I think in sometimes concoct it in order to try and close down space for solidarity with the Palestinian cause, or even just expressions of Palestinianness. And I'll give you an example. There was a hospital in London which had a display of paintings done by children in Gaza, right? And these were children's paintings. None of these paintings were of Yahya Sinwar, right? None of them were an RPG. They were children's paintings, mostly with the dove of peace and stuff like that, hopes for a better future. UK Lawyers for Israel put together a letter claiming that Jewish patients felt harassed and intimidated by the presence of these paintings and they got taken down. Now, two things are possible. One is that people genuinely felt harassed and threatened by the presence of children's paintings, in which case, get a fucking grip. Get a grip. Or this is a cynical manipulation of the discourses which are about, lived experience, and people get to define the oppression that, they face, and, you've got to listen to them and in order to achieve a political goal. In this case, closing down space for expressions of Palestinian identity and things which humanize Palestinians. And so I think that is part of the story of why, these ideas around, standpoint epistemology, lived experience, always believe the victim. The victim is the person who sets themselves up as the victim. I think that, Trump, of course, hugely important. The fact that, working class people of color being alienated by these politics, hugely important. I also think that a reason why this is maybe, even that sort of university educated, city living, kind of progressive is also perhaps starting to move away from it, is because you're seeing it being weaponized in the context of the genocide.
Would it be, and I feel like it's probably worth throwing this out just because I imagine, in conversations I've had with people, I imagine there will be people watching this thinking, oh no, Novara throwing identity politics, completely out, we're going to get thrown under the bus. And I suppose it might be worth us sort of speaking about why we think that's not the implication of what we're saying. I mean, I suppose to go first on that, because I get, I've been subject to criticism for this already. Heat, yeah. I think one thing that has been actually a feature of wokeness and has been self-defeating is to take a position, sometimes a fairly maximalist position, and then to say, if you disagree with it, you're going to be subjected to social pressure. Now, social pressure doesn't, it doesn't have to be, it's not the worst thing ever, let's say, to be subject to social pressure. But what it tends to do is make people feel, okay, I'm not going to enter that debate again. Now, I've had this a couple of times with sort of trans issues, where I've said there are certain areas where I feel like a maximalist position doesn't really hold up. So sports, for example, prisons, etc. And I think you're only going to have a successful trans politics where you make some compromises there. And I don't actually think that's a sort of compromise because of public opinion. I think that's correct, right? I think that the reason you have sex segregated sports is because you don't want male advantage in the women's category. If people have male advantage, maybe they shouldn't be in the women's category, right? It's perfectly also fine for people to disagree with me. But one thing I think that wokeness has done is it's meant that many people who have a sort of in-betweeny position have stayed completely silent.
Lots of people don't know, right?
On any kind of sensitive issue. And I think that has put the left in a very vulnerable, fragile position. Because essentially what has happened is, the left has had a fairly maximalist position on so many issues: borders, police,
is that
on
true?
Trans rights. The
left has had a maximalist position on board. I mean, you've got a Labour government in this country with a big majority. They didn't win that majority saying we're going to, but they're not scrap borders.
So I suppose it depends.
So Kamala Harris, hold on, let me clarify this because Kamala Harris in this thinking is the left. She lost because of the left, but Labour win, and that's because they're not part of the left. I mean, that doesn't seem quite coherent.
Well, so I think electorally,
I love it when you guys fight.
Electorally, lots of what happened this year you can see as a bit of a hangover from sort of 2020. So obviously, Kamala Harris in 2020, woke's kind of over, right? We've said that, So when Kamala Harris went to the US electorate and said, I'm actually a centrist, people looked at the clips of what she'd said in 2019, 2020 and said, are you really? I mean, she spoke positively about defund the police. She said she would decriminalize border crossings. She did tick a box that said she would, support trans operations for illegal immigrants in detention centres. I'm not upset about that, but these were all things that she felt she had to do because she wanted to appeal to the left. So I think the idea that these weren't left-wing positions is not true. And I think one of the reasons why in that sort of race to be the left candidate in the Democratic primaries sort of led people to those positions is because people hadn't really found a way to have a moderate position on those issues.
Because, Bernie Sanders famously said that open borders, I think he said it as Recline, open borders is a Koch brothers proposal. Mick Lynch wouldn't say, we need open borders and police abolition. And I do sometimes feel with what you just said there, clearly big parts of like the young, urban, graduate left think that. I mean, probably actually that's the majority opinion. It's a very big sphere of opinion. But it's not the left. I mean, I think that's just I just don't know if that's helpful, Michael, when you say that.
Well, let's not say the left then. Let's say the woke culture. I think woke culture has deemed positions that aren't maximalist to be not only wrong, it's fine to agree with someone, but offensive.
I mean, woke culture is sort of interesting in that it occupies this sort of like a very powerful position within the sort of like movement left, right? Which you'd sort of think of as like extra parliamentary, right, in some way. And also very powerful within, like NGOs and corporations as well. That is a weird two places to operate. And I think that's maybe part of this discussion about, is it the left, is it not? Well, that doesn't include, Mick Lynch and rah. Is that like actually we're talking about a kind of like movement to left, which like also was particularly powerful in the States at the time because of BLM, right? And because of the size of those mobilizations, and there are good reasons for that. And also like, weirdly powerful in these corporate spaces.
But can I just say, there was somebody in the US and they said, Donald Trump is going to deal with Marxism in this country. And they were asked, what do you mean? And they said, Wall Street. Right. So they think Wall Street is the left, right? That's just how, screwed up things are at the moment. And I feel like by saying, it's almost like repeating the right's analysis is that Coutts Bank is left wing because they have a pride flag on their, on the front of their building during, Pride Month. And it's almost like saying, well, that's the left's position, therefore Coutts is the left. I feel like almost, because you're a very clever man, you're a journalist. I know you say, well, maybe I'm not as left-wing as people think I am or I used to be. I still would say I think you're on the left personally, centre-left. It's almost like you're repeating some of the shibboleths of the right, I think, which fundamentally mischaracterize the left. Because the left, like the right, like the centre, like the Green movement, like any political movement, is very heterogeneous. And the task of activism is trying to make it homogenous for long enough to a majority or to change a policy.
Well, if you define the left as something which includes the current leadership of the Labour Party, then obviously none of what I'm saying applies, right? So if you're considering the left to be something to the left of the current leadership of the Labour Party, then I would say that because of some of the processes I've described, sort of like it being, if you come in with a position which is not maximalist on certain issues, which people can argue from identity, it's more trouble than it's worth. You don't do it. Means that I think on many issues, people to the left of the current leadership of the Labour Party have zero influence. zero influence. Now, there are many issues sort of when it comes to economics where people to the left of the current leadership of the Labour Party do have some influence because they've formulated ideas which can persuade a significant number of people. When it comes to immigration, when it comes to police, when it comes to trans rights, people to the left of the current leadership of the Labour Party have zero influence because they only, there is no one to the left of the Labour Party that I think is having conversations about those sensitive issues which can speak to a majority audience, because they have been the kind of issue where you're constantly walking on eggshells if you talk about it. And that's meant that there isn't really a sort of position that's coherent or sellable or strong.
I mean, I think to go back to the question that you put out, which is like, there are going to be some people watching this being like, is Novara as an organization like, chucking identity politics away and sort of moving to the right? I mean, obviously, we have a pluralist organization. People think different things, and that's what I like about it. So I'm going to talk from me rather than for the organization. The change in my orientation in my politics is this. One, if you're coming from a minority position, whether that's because of an identity characteristic or you hold a minority opinion, you are much better off trying to emphasize the ways in which you are like somebody else rather than the ways in which you aren't like somebody else. So rather than trying to, I guess, like play up the scariness or the scale of your demand. I mean, I think I speak to some people who describe themselves as gender abolitionists. I'm like, well, good luck with that. You are talking about like such a tiny, tiny proportion of people, and you are trying to overturn something which is meaningful for the vast majority of people. I don't think that's going to work. I also don't think that's going to get you that much closer to, the cause of advancing trans rights. I think that, persuasion works when you emphasize shared humanity. And that means putting that shared humanity front and center, right? Like, that's the first thing I think. The second thing I think is that, this obsession with language, and also I think a misuse of certain kinds of language, is a product of middle class graduates like myself, who then get to sort of take up loads of space and say, well, the experience of all people of color or of all migrants or all trans people or all whoever is my experience. And that's why I think you have a focus on things like language, things like microaggressions, and the sort of elevation of these ideas, because ultimately I'm quite well off, right? I'm doing fairly well, I'm not worried about...
You're speaking personally, but we're talking about these people. Do you think that applies to them as well?
Well, when I say well off, I mean, you're not working, multiple jobs, multiple cleaning jobs, right? You're not having to deal with, lots of different kinds of material dispossession, a lot of which is racialized. And so I think that there's a kind of focus on, the subjective individual experience, because for you, the stakes are relatively low. And I'll give you an example, and I don't want to pick on this person, but there was an article in The Guardian, and it's one of those ones where I just had to shut my laptop because I was like, fuck this. And it was about the experience of South Asians going into yoga classes. Now, you may not have noticed, but I am South Asian. And I do also like going to yoga. And someone described the experience of being a South Asian going into a majority white yoga class, or where the teacher is white, as being traumatic. Traumatic. Right? If going into a majority white yoga class in a majority white country is traumatic, then what words are we going to use for when, a teenage black girl is being strip searched at her school, or, someone is being unfairly targeted by immigration enforcement, right? Like, the problem is that if you go about all the really small stuff, no one is going to believe you on the big stuff, right? It's called The Boy Who Cried Wolf, except here it's like, crying trauma at the yoga class.
But also, if you're going to say, look, for me as a brown person going into this space full of white people doing yoga, I find that traumatic. I just think that creates so much credibility for a white person to go into a majority non-white area and say, I find this traumatic, which, by the way, they shouldn't. That's ridiculous. And I think you're creating like that.
But the credibility crisis comes from, I'm sorry, sounding insane.
Yeah, of course it's insane. But you're normalizing the idea of, well, there's loads of people who look different to me, therefore I'm feeling a sense of moral injury. I mean, it's a really dangerous thing to normalize. And I don't think many people realize how dangerous it is if the majority ethnic group or the majority culture starts adopting that. And I just want to say quickly, we live in this weird moment because all the things we're ascribing to the left, lots of it also applies to the right. For some reason, in 2024 in Britain, everybody's black-pilled. Betrayal narratives are everywhere. Everybody's being betrayed all of the time. Everybody feels a sense of moral injury. You see it on the right, by the way, massively. All these people saying, Farage has let us down. Farage has done this. Oh my God, he's just a centrist as well. And so I think this speaks to, yes, of course, we're talking about the left because that's what we're interested in. That's the sort of part of the political spectrum we come from, we know more about. But I do think also that lots of the things we've touched upon today they're also just part of the broader political culture and the broader culture that we all inhabit.
I mean, look, I know that you're not going to see this slogan on a cap anytime soon, but I'm just like, make harm material again, right? Like the concept of epistemic harm, I think, has gone too far.
That's tough. And that's very left wing. That is not something the right does.
I mean, I suppose that sort of talking, there's a danger with the boy who cries wolf if you're saying I was harmed by going into this yoga class. I think there is another aspect to this, which is that it is possible that woman did feel actual harm going into that yoga class, which isn't a rational response. And I feel like there has been an element of, I don't know, you're right, it's not just a left-wing thing, but let's say sort of modern grievance culture, whereby you strengthen your argument by being more harmed. You're sort of encouraging people to say...
It's about victimhood.
You're encouraging people to feel like victims. You're encouraging people to see the worst in other people. So the moment someone says anything that could be interpreted as racist or sexist or transphobic, you say they are. Not just you say they are, you believe they are. And if you believe everyone is out to get you, then that's not going to be very good for your mental health. It's controversial mentioning Jonathan Haidt because I know he's not seen as suspicious by many on the left. But I do think that he has an interesting concept in The Coddling of the American Mind, which is he says that sort of modern university culture, is writing this in 2018, does reverse CBT on people. So CBT sort of is the idea, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Cool boys therapy.
Cool boys therapy. Yeah, it tells you don't assume the world is out to get you. Don't assume the worst when someone says something. Think about having agency, right? You can change your situation. Don't necessarily assume that what you feel is actually happening. Take a step back. Maybe there is a different scenario going on here and you're jumping to conclusions. Whereas he's describing university culture. And I would say, I know you're saying that I'm tarring too much of the left, but I'd say there's a certain type of politics which is also sort of doing reverse CBT on people, which is saying, if you feel harmed, you're harmed. If you think that they're treating you with prejudice, they probably are. And then you go through the world feeling constantly aggrieved and scared. And I suppose one of the things that I think most about when it comes to Novara Live now is I don't want to be part of doing reverse CBT on my audience. I feel really strongly about it because I think it, there is a lot of anxiety around at the moment. I think it's mainly to do with smartphones, but I do think that there is a political culture which has made people more anxious than they need to be.
I'm going to move us along, but I not because I'm trying to cancel you, Michael, or silence you, just because we have a finite amount of time.
I'm going to assume the best.
The worst.
I'm doing pro CBT on me.
And if you think that you're being silenced out of latent homophobia on my part, it's true. You are.
Can I also just say that on the agency thing, that's not just CBT. Mm-hmm. That's Karl Marx. People make history under conditions, not necessarily their own making, but they still make history.
100%. But I'm going to move us on. Trying to find a way to talk about all of the big geopolitical shifts of this year is impossible. You've obviously got Ukraine entering 2025 with the possibility of having to cede substantial amounts of territory in return for a peace deal. You've got Israel in Gaza, in Lebanon, and as of a couple of days ago, making significant incursions into the Golan Heights in Syria and destroying the Syrian navy. You've got the sort of ongoing specter of China and possible ambitions towards Taiwan. And I think you've got the sense that international law is a talking shop, right? It's just yak to yak. It's not changing what states do. So my way of trying to bring this all together in one question is this. Are expansionist wars back for good? We'll start with you, Aaron.
Are they back for good? Well, Russia's behaviour, not just towards Ukraine, but also Georgia in 2008, obviously in the Crimea in 2014 as well, there's been a shift. I mean, I think Seamus Milne talks about 2008, we think of the global financial crisis, but actually, probably more important was Russia's invasion of Georgia in a weird way. Kind of interesting, right? He's clever despite what, all his detractors said between 2015 and 2019. So this has been a long time coming. We are clearly moving towards a world of multipolarity. In 1999, the West produced 4/5 of global GDP. Today it's 3/5. An extraordinary shift of economic wealth and with that political power as well. And, we are moving to this multipolar world. You have this bizarre take from some people on the supposed left. They're absolutely not. I won't say the gentleman's name because I say it far too often, or I have done in the past, which is multipolarity is kind of left-wing code for supporting Russia or China.
It's always like, that's who it's talking about.
And it's not. It's just a simple observation that, political and economic power is flowing from outside the heartland of the Atlantic, of Europe and North America. That's kind of changing. It's changing in a ton of ways, whether that's the rise of African cuisine. You've now got African Michelin-star restaurants in London. You've got Korean soft power, cultural products being exported around the world, whether it's Chinese EVs destroying the German car industry. Clearly, the world is changing in quite impressive ways really quickly. And it means that cultural, political, economic power is shifting away from the West. Now, tie that to the expansionist wars question. I think that's really interesting. They are back, and I think that's partly an outgrowth of the collapse of US empire. We're talking in the days after Assad's escape to Russia. What I find fascinating with that, and HTS effectively, taking over the Syrian state, is that was a shift in regime not overseen by the US. Fundamentally, it was pushed by Turkey, a powerful regional player, which is really new, I think. It's really, really new. Obviously, the US has a role there. Yes, of course, they're training people. Yes, of course, there's a US base in the south of Syria. I'm not, naive enough to think the CIA didn't have some role in getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. But I think the people who pushed this over the edge were the Turks, and I think that really speaks to moving to this multipolar world. And I think Turkey is actually the act that's not talked about enough. Right now in Ukraine, you have Turkish drones used, you have Iranian drones used, I think you have Israeli drones used. So even these leading military technologies now are no longer the plaything of solely the West. And so I think for me, that's the interesting question, right? So expansionist wars, if you believe that the US was an imperial power in the world of unipolarity, which I do, I think we probably agree it was an imperial power. So that hasn't changed, but I think we are moving towards a world of not competing imperialisms. I don't buy that because, China doesn't have the world's reserve currency. But certainly a multipolar world where expansionism is more normal. But you do get some counter-arguments there. So, for instance, Iran has an ultra-nationalist sort of sentiment within it, and those people would quite like bits of Afghanistan and bits of, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and that isn't the default of Iranian politics right now. It's more religiously inclined, etc., and it's about national security. And the reason why they fund people like Hezbollah or backed Assad is because they viewed that as a way of maintaining Iran's safety. It was a very sort of forward-leaning sense.
Well, it's about fencing in Israel, a lot of it, right?
Basically, they said, look, if we support Lebanon, if we support Hamas, if we support the Houthis in Yemen, etc., that's how they sold it. It's a defensive strategy. It means that they can't come and bomb Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz. So I don't view that strategy as an expansionist Iranian strategy. That said, I do think we're probably moving to an era where, if there was regime change in Iran and there was some senior Revolutionary Guard general became, Reza Shah Mark II, yeah, I can imagine him trying to annex Herat in Afghanistan, saying this is a Persian city, it has been for 2,000 years. I feel like Russia's civilizational claims on parts of Ukraine is a big key shift from how 20th century politics legitimized itself.
I mean, I suppose the question I would like to put to you, Michael, particularly because you've followed the events of October 7th so closely in your work on Novara Live, is if you sort of take from October 8th to now, does Israel emerge the clear winner in the Middle East? So there's something of a power vacuum because America has, withdrawn from Afghanistan. It's focusing much more on Eastern Europe. It's focusing on Russia. It's focusing in a kind of different way on China. And Israel first is able to wage a terrible genocide in Gaza with aims of settlement, but also shows up Hezbollah as not having the kind of, long range kind of technology that they claim to have. Clearly, Iran's ability to cause substantial damage to Israel is limited. You've now, with the fall of Assad, you've lost the land bridge between Iran and Hezbollah in terms of the flow of weapons. Does Israel, it's still a contested regional power, but does it emerge as the dominant regional power?
I think regionally, it's been an overwhelming success and more than anyone had imagined. So, you saw it from sort of the multipolarity guys, but also, fairly centrist people sort of saying Israel can't really afford to have a war on all of these fronts. Yes, they might be able to sort of have a fight with Hamas, but Hezbollah has so many rockets that it will, Israel might have all of these defensive capacities with Iron Dome, but every time it fires up one of these intercepting missiles, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, and ultimately they might not have the industrial capacity to keep this up. So that there were lots of credible, and I often found them persuasive, arguments that Israel couldn't afford to have a war on all of these fronts. Now, regionally, Israel has just, won. In a way, people say you can't kill an idea, but they have decapitated Hezbollah, which is why Assad has fallen. Iran seems a lot weaker than it was because its strength came from the axis of resistance, which is to say, don't attack us because we will threaten you with our proxies. Hezbollah aren't just a proxy, but they were an organization which Iran could use as a sort of defensive measure to say, if you go for us, Hezbollah will be activated. Now, Hezbollah, not really a threat. Assad, gone. Iran, the axis of resistance, massively, undermined. Where I think it's less clear, sort of where Israel will be victorious, is what it's doing in Palestine, right? Because it's still not clear to me how there is an end game that works. Obviously they've got away with carrying out way more atrocities than sort of we might have imagined. I think that has massively sort of damaged the Americans' ability to ever sort of say that there is some sort of international law that should be upheld. I think that's been shown for the sham that it probably always was. But I was re-listening to your Ilan Pappé interview, and I do think probably the long-term threat to Israel is if it no longer is seen as in the vital interests of, is something which Jews around the world, and especially liberal Jews, see as something in their interest to exist. And he talked about, didn't he, that there's the state of Israel and the state of Judea, and the state of Judea being just very explicitly a right-wing nationalist project. And what Israel is doing in Gaza clearly is taking it much, much, much further in that direction. And if, the coalition who are willing to defend Israel massively shrinks, that will be a problem for them. So regionally, I think unambiguously massive success. In terms of the long-term strategic future of Israel, much more questionable.
So on Israel, I think that's right. It's been a huge success. They've basically eliminated Hezbollah for a long time. They've obviously landed a few punches on Iran, although of course Iran has also sent hundreds of projectiles that hit. Some of which hit Israel, which had literally never happened before. You've got Bashar al-Assad has gone. So that's all a big win for Israel. And I think lots of the people you're talking about, the multipolarity people, and even the centrist people, saying, look, Israel cannot wage a war on all these fronts. There were really big constraints on Israel, right? But ultimately, Netanyahu and the people around him and Washington have said, you know what? Okay, fine. We'll have a 2-year recession. Okay, fine. We'll torch US credibility overseas. Okay, fine. We'll completely make a mockery of international institutions and international law. Okay, fine. I'll use American deficits. Bear in mind, Joe Biden has been using deficit funding. This is not like money America has. It doesn't have the money to send to Israel. All this is deficit funded. It's all deficit finance. Joe Biden in the last several years has been running the biggest deficits in US history. And even then, they still find tens of billions to send to Israel in terms of economic aid and weapons and so on. And I think, justifiably actually, I think most people, whenever in October 2023 or November 2023, I think most people would have said, that can't happen. Really? The Israeli public is willing to accept 2-year recession. The US public is willing to, Joe Biden is willing to risk, the Democrats. I know you don't think it was an issue in terms of the election, but in an election year, you want US credibility like that to be destroyed overseas and so on. So the Israelis took a huge bunch of gambles and they seem to have paid off. But at the same time, I think that I agree with you. Elon's hypothesis that the state of Judea ultimately will kill the state of Israel, I think is probably correct. And this idea now that you have an expansionist Israeli state, and it's not just with regards to the West Bank and Gaza, they've taken Syrian land, and you've recently seen a piece, I think in the Times of Israel, about the need for Israel, and this is not satire, to have Lebensraum.
Yes, this is in the Times of Israel.
Yeah. Growing Israeli population, of course, by the way, it's growing far more than any high GDP country in the world. I think presently population of 10 million, of course, only about 8 million Israeli Jews. Projected, I think, by 2050 to hit 15 million, because you've got a fertility rate of 3 in Israel. And it's already a very densely populated place. So, of course, it's a coherent thing to say you need land. So you see these 19th century articulations of expansionism, we need living space, which is just utterly extraordinary. And the West, the crazy thing is, the West is enabling it, supporting it, funding it. I will never understand why Britain is a party to that. I will never get my head around that.
I guess I want to just shift our focus onto Ukraine for a moment, because I suppose there are some interesting parallels here, right? Because Israel's war effort is, so dependent on US military aid, right? There's no way they could be fighting a war on all these fronts without US military aid, right? It's absolutely essential to them. But politically, that seems to be viewed very differently in American politics than the military aid to Ukraine, which obviously, Trump has been swinging the sword of Damocles over that thing for ages, and it sort of seems like, okay, time's up. The election of Donald Trump seems to have had an immediate impact on what Zelensky has said about what he's willing to accept. For a long time, and this was also the position being parroted by Washington and parroted by Westminster, and it was always insane, was, the goal is total defeat of Russia, the entirety of Ukrainian territory being intact and being brought back. So I guess that would include Crimea and the territory seized a few years ago. That was always insane and unreasonable, I think. And I'm not talking about morally unreasonable.
It wasn't moral. That's the key distinction.
Sorry, not morally unreasonable, but unreasonable in the sense of I don't think that is going to happen. With the balance of power being what it is, not morally unreasonable, just practically. And now Zelensky is saying, well, in order to have peace, I'm willing to give up some territory. He's talking about that explicitly in terms of Crimea. I think it would be difficult to see how that doesn't include, parts of the Donbass. It's difficult to predict what happens in 2025. It's difficult to predict what Donald Trump does. If Russia emerges with a peace deal where they get to keep Ukrainian territory, and I guess I'm thinking about this in terms of Crimea plus, does that mean that's a win for Russia? They've won. Their strategy won.
Is it a win for Russia? I suppose, Putin can definitely legitimately claim victory. I assume he's going to see it as a victory. Do you our country's going to see that and think, great, let's do that. I mean, it's clearly come at an enormous cost to Russia. I don't think they can just sort of say this is a brilliant cost-free victory.
Has it, though?
Come at cost?
Well, Putin's still politically popular. I mean, obviously, the polling that comes from inside Russia isn't all that reliable, but he's still... And the economic hit is nowhere near as big as people were saying. Obviously, many people have died, but I think you can make the reasonable conclusion that Vladimir Putin doesn't particularly care about that.
That's partly because of a war economy, though, isn't it? I mean, I suppose if for a Russia that would be sort of integrated into the modern economy, you can say lots of those people have left. I mean, I suppose you could make a similar argument to sort of like the state of Israel and the state of Judea. Sort of, this has definitely made Russia a more conservative, less integrated country. But I mean, if this is spurred industrial production, then maybe they can sort of, after the war, I suppose people are going to be buying weapons for a very long time. Maybe they can become a weapons manufacturer for the world.
I mean, the Russian economy by PPP, which is, it's not nominal GDP, you're measuring the size of the economy by the domestic currency and what it can purchase domestically. And of course, given people in Russia buy things generally made in Russia because there's lots of energy, lots of food. By that measure, I think in the last 2 years, Russia has overtaken both Germany and Japan. And that's partly because they haven't grown at all. But I mean, that's quite extraordinary, right? So the idea that the disincentives are what maybe people were thinking and predicting a couple of years ago, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I'd also say, actually, and this hasn't really been touched upon, if there is a negotiation, there's peace, let's say it's on the present borders, you have some sort of demilitarized zone, I would presume also in any peace settlement that you'd also have a renormalization or a reset of relations with Russia. So all the sanctions would end. It would just be bizarre. Wouldn't it just be bizarre? All this has happened. People are saying this guy's like hitting, and all of a sudden you say, okay, you know what? BP and Shell can go back to Russia now. I think civil society in the US and the UK and across Europe be like, what? This is bizarre. What? Really? And at the same time, NATO is saying we have to increase our defense budgets because of Russia. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act there. And actually, I buy the argument that Russia probably would invade Lithuania, actually. I probably buy that. And on the other hand, of course, if there is a peace settlement, Vladimir Putin does look at cities like Odessa as Russian. So, I mean, is that good enough for the domestic political constituencies for him?
Potentially. I don't know. I'm not an expert. It's a very interesting question.
Get them on Novara Live, Michael.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm gonna move us along. And I guess my question is this: have we already missed the boat on 1.5 degrees of global temperature change? And with the election of Donald Trump, does that effectively mean that countries' climate commitments aren't worth the paper that they're written on? Because if America can go all in on drill baby drill, why should other countries hold back their development?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think anyone has ever really thought we were going to hit 1.5. We're not going to hit 1.5. We're going to overshoot 1.5. I think if sort of countries meet their sort of the plans that they've sort of currently put forward as part of the Paris Agreement, we get to 2.1, which isn't, it's not great, not the end of the world. It's not sort of the 5 degrees that people were talking about 4 years ago. So some progress has been made. I mean, I think the election of Donald Trump, for me, and this is a conversation we've been having on Novara Live recently, it is a demonstration that, the solution to climate change in liberal democracies can't be fundamentally political, right? You are not going to get a stable climate coalition of people who are willing to pay significant costs and sort of forego their consumption habits to sort of have impacts that will be felt in 30 years' time. I just don't think that's going to happen. I feel like people have sort of been kidding themselves for a while that is a politics that works, and I don't think it does. I think, luckily, it probably doesn't need to work to avoid sort of the worst features of climate change. The reason why...
Geoengineering, is this what
well, no, I mean, geoengineering is sort of at the extreme end, but more significantly, it's just that green energy has become vastly, vastly, vastly cheaper over the past decade. I think there were smart parts of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which is that it didn't come with many sticks at all. He decided the way I pass this is it's not going to really impose any costs or taxes on anyone. But what I'm going to do is put loads of money into industrial policy, into green energy and other sort of green manufacturing projects. It just so happens that most of those are in red states, so Republican states. there's not really any political incentive for Donald Trump to say, I'm going to remove those subsidies, which are creating jobs in red states. And so there's no reason why I think, a Donald Trump presidency, to be honest, Biden didn't stop any drilling for fossil fuels. So
that is the quintessential Obama legacy, actually, is that the US became this fracking superpower.
So I'm not that clear, beyond, obviously, Donald Trump puts a real nail in the coffin that we can achieve this via sort of international agreements where people are held to their obligations. But we abandoned that a long time ago. The sort of innovation of Paris, the Paris Agreement, was that for a very long time, the Kyoto Protocol had been aiming to achieve some kind of deal where countries committed to, or countries were distributed sort of out their rights to emit carbon, and then they would be held to that. Now, the major powers would never agree to that. They didn't. Like a realist in the international relations department would have told you that sort of in 1997. They would have said, you're wasting your time, right? You are not going to get America or China to commit to reducing their sovereignty over what they can produce in their own territory. So the innovation of Paris was to say, let's make this voluntary. And the reason why you have had governments sort of come forward with ever more ambitious pledges is because the technology has got ever more cheap, right? So for me, I think you see it as a problem of industrial strategy. You see it as a problem of technological innovation. Put loads of money into those areas which are still really hard to decarbonize, and then it won't matter so much if there's a backlash against green policies at the ballot box, because it will be cheaper to go green anyway.
Just on the industrial strategy point, I was watching an interview with AOC where she was talking about the Civilian Climate Corps, and she was saying, 20,000 jobs created as part of the Civilian Climate Corps. Most of them are in not-for-profits. And she was like, this is the first major step, really, really talking it up. When you compare it to, the New Deal policies, you compare it to the Conservation Civilian Corps, that was 3 million jobs. The scale of job creation through, sort of Inflation Reduction Act, through CHIPS, through, the kind of like Green New Deal light, which Biden passed, was tiny compared to how it had been talked up. So isn't there also a problem here about, scale in delivery? And that does create a credibility problem for the left. When I'm talking about, Green New Deal, right? So it's a phrase and a framing which is beloved by the left in this country, by which I'm sort of talking about, the Labour left, and then also the sort of like NGO world as well. The problem is 20,000 jobs in America. That's not very many jobs.
I think CHIPS created something like 30,000, I don't know. And CHIPS, again, you're talking multiple millions of dollars per job, right? And I'm not joking. And of course, when you're talking about renewable energy, you're talking about microprocessors. These are industries which are massively capital intensive. What does that mean? When something's capital intensive, you don't need much labor, right? It's not labor intensive to produce microprocessors in lithographic printing. That requires really expensive machines. So I think that's right. There are some small things which I think are really smart, like the Greens, for instance, want to introduce a GCSE around, nature, like a green GCSE. Kids should study this stuff at school. And I think, I support the idea of national service. Wait for it. Not to join the military. I've always said this. But the idea of you should complete some kind of public service after finishing your schooling, and that should basically mean you get your A-levels, right? And I don't think that should be like jobs, because I don't want to depress wages in the labour market. But I would love to see something like young kids being offered, or 18-year-olds, being offered the alternatives of, 8 weeks to do stuff in your local community. This is volunteering, not for a year. I'm sort of trying to bait people when I say national service. I'm not about 2 or 3 years. I'm about 8 weeks. Or something to do with nature restoration and rewilding in the UK. I think that'd be wonderful. I think it'd be wonderful to get kids from, southeast of England going up to the Scottish Highlands and discovering what a pine marten is, and what this tree is, and what that tree is, and local dialect for snow. I think it'd be amazing.
What is a pine marten? Cocktail of some kind?
A pine marten is I don't know the kind of.
It's like a big weasel thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's kind of like a stoat or a polecat. I think it was kind of.
I think this is a lovely idea. I'm not sure how it's getting us to 1.5 degrees.
No, but hold on. No, so no. So I think long term, that's the kind of policy. I think the idea that you could teach this stuff to millions of kids, and within a small fraction of them, really kindle a passion for nature and environmental restoration, even just with that qualification. I think that's actually a really powerful thing. And I think often on the left, we don't talk about actually these little things that you could do which would make stuff better. We talk about the big stuff. And actually, but the big stuff can go really badly wrong. Your point, however, is correct. Democracies, I think, won't be able to do the things that they are saying on this. And I think actually that's a big challenge for the 2030s, is increasingly people say, look, actually, democracies can't solve this stuff. Look at Germany's economic industrial model right now. Its car industry is collapsing. It can't compete with Chinese exports, dependent on Russian energy. Can German democracy, can the democratic system in Germany revive its economic model for the 21st century? Who knows? Don't think so.
Well, I always find that there's sort of language sometimes here slips a little bit. So there's the question of, it's often phrased, can capitalism solve climate change? Can liberal democracy solve climate change? No, but is it consistent with climate change to have a largely capitalist economy and a bunch of liberal democracies? Probably, right? So
you mean markets, right?
Well, no, I don't think we need it to radically transform the capitalist system to get our emissions down. That's largely because of a lot of state funding by China to make solar power radically cheaper. The slippage, I think, is that I don't think you're going to find a market mechanism that solves capitalism. You're going to need a lot of state funding, not according to market mechanisms, which is what the Chinese did. But there's no reason why, because we in the West can't solve some of the politically difficult climate problems, we can't piggyback off the Chinese having made solar power really cheap.
Well, I think that realistically, like I said, the story of the next 20, 25 years is you're going to see really the world bifurcate into two spheres of influence, technological, cultural. One will be Chinese, Pax Sinica. One will be American, Western-led. And I actually think there is a world out there where, because we're not in the Chinese sphere of influence, our green tech isn't as good as somewhere like Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. There is a world out there in 30 years' time where Central Asia and Laos have better high-speed trains than we do in Europe, because we're tied to the US and we're tied to the Western Alliance. So who knows how this plays out, Michael? But what I would say is, and I think it's a really key observation you made, and you said that on Novara Live, and at the time I was really angry with you over geoengineering. Of course, you're right to say there is literally no precedent in peacetime for democratic electorates to vote against their own perceived economic self-interest, that's basically been the bet of like a lot of green NGOs over the last 20 years. There's no precedent for it.
It's not going to happen. And geoengineering, I think we're probably going to have to brighten some clouds in specific locations.
Speaking of brightening clouds, I suppose the place that I wanted to end up with is, what are your hopes and ambitions for 2025? They can be political. They can be with regards to your role in Novara. They can be personal if you want. Interpret it as broadly as you like.
Why don't you start? You're not talking. You're the smartest one of the three of us, and you don't talk enough today. So I think you should start.
I don't think that's very true. Okay, what are my hopes and ambitions for 2025? Okay, speaking purely personally, one is that I want to, through my writing and the things that I say, try and model a kind of commitment to anti-racism and various forms of social progress which are rooted in class politics and majoritarian politics and are not based in guilt, shame, and using social ostracism as a mechanism of social coercion. That's for me a priority, not because I think that it impacts loads and loads of people, but because I think that is a culture which is hamstringing the left, like just completely destroying our ability to persuade people to organize together and to do anything of value. It keeps us small, it keeps us suspicious, and it keeps us, I think, frankly, unattractive people to want to associate with. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that there's like a broader set of ideas that I've been kind of writing about, which is about, I guess, a kind of way of thinking about human relationships and our experience of each other and our experience of the world, and how corroded it's been by various logics of disposability. And so this is thinking about consumerism and thinking about what does it do to us to buy so many items which are designed to be thrown away. What does that make us feel about our own labor? What's our relationship to our own labor? I think it's more than just alienated, like under modern capitalism. And also, there are so many technological means of which are supposed to foster human connection, which are based on the idea of throwing people away. So just swiping, infinite scroll. Like, I found it really depressing when I was on dating apps. I haven't been on dating apps for a while, but when I was on them, just like looking at all these hopeful faces and just being like, nope. Like, I don't think that's good for us. I don't think it's good for us mentally. I don't think it's good for us politically. And so I think that there are maybe some lines of connectivity that you can draw between the production of things, our economic conditions, our working conditions, our social conditions, and our mental conditions as well. I don't really know what shape that project would take, but I hope to write it. So those are my hopes and ambitions. One is to do with delivering or helping to deliver a coup de grace to liberal identity politics on one hand, and the other is, I guess, thinking about disposability and how it's poisoning us, and sort of what a renewed ethic of commitment looks like.
And of course, you do have a soon-to-be best-selling book coming out next year.
Inshallah.
So that's going to be the foundation. What about you, Michael?
I think professionally, the main thing I think about at the moment is, so a couple of things. I think polarization has been quite bad for politics and quite bad for the left. Now, some of it's inevitable, but I think there has been a movement to embrace it, which I think I was part of as well, really, to sort of say polarization is actually a political strategy that's going to get the goods. And I think that has often been based on saying the people you disagree with are idiots. Anyone who might seem like they're putting forward a reasonable argument on the other side, well, let's actually just assume that they've got nefarious motivations. And I think what that leads to is, a politics which isn't very nice, and also a lack of curiosity. I think we've sort of embraced confirmation bias to some degree, where it's sort of like everyone's saying, well, I see it sometimes in the comments. Like, I love our audience, but sometimes I see it in the comments, which is, I want reliable analysis. And what people mean by reliable analysis is people who are saying things they agree with. So it's sort of like, you can basically sort of collect arguments and bits of evidence for any conclusion you want to some degree. Like, the difficulty is to say, am I looking at the broad sweep of evidence and giving what I genuinely think is a sort of relatively, as unbiased as one can be, accurate conclusion, as opposed to merely cherry picking arguments that fit my preconceived conclusions. Like, I think that is a style of journalism which has, run its course in many spheres. So I want to sort of encourage more open-mindedness, let's say. The other thing is about everyone's mental. I want everyone to be a little bit happier. I was saying this to you the other day, wasn't I? That sort of one thing that worries me is, sometimes that's, I'm sure it all happens to all of us, right? People come up to you and say, oh, I like your work, da, 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 da. Thankfully, people don't normally come up and sort of say, I hate everything you do. It has happened a couple of times recently, but we'll leave that to one side. But the thing that is said sometimes that I find troubling is, how do you stay cheerful? And I realize that's because, the show is often just showing you miserable thing happening. And I'm like, well, actually, I am quite cheerful, really, because while I reckon that there's loads of terrible things happening, I'm not going to apologize for the amount we cover Gaza, which is obviously going to, really trouble people, as it should. But also on the side, I'm quite boosterish about human progress. I look at all these charts where the line is going up, and
you're a super smart himbo, to be honest.
They're lines that you want to go up. And so I feel bad that the content I'm producing is making people more depressed about the world than I am. And I suppose I want to bring a bit more of that positivity or hopefulness into the content without it seeming glib.
My hopes for next year, I want to be part of a conversation where we talk about alternatives to capitalism without seeming weird. And we need to talk about alternatives to capitalism. This is really coming to a head now. By 2030, we could have radical right governments in the Netherlands, Italy, France, Germany, maybe even here too, in the context of demographic aging, I think permanently low growth. I think QE, quantitative easing, did something to Western economies which we will never undo. I think it's destroyed our economic model, actually. The great acceleration of the 20th century of just consuming more stuff, more growth, more people, it's over. And that's the thought world of our parents and our grandparents. And that's why they assume things will get better. Or maybe they won't, actually. And I think we now need to be seriously talking about an alternative economic system without also saying, and that's why we need a revolution to get rid of the Labour Party and don't vote for anybody. These are two separate things, right? One is a timeline of 6 months. Do I want rail in public ownership? Yes. By the way, I didn't vote for Labour in the last general election, so please, in the comments, don't come after me. But in the medium to long term, we need a left which is really serious, and I'm very open about short-term social democratic commitments. When I say short-term, I mean my lifetime. But I do think that we are in the middle of a transition, which is at times going to be very ugly, and I think we need to be honest about that. And I think the fertility rate thing and a falling human population, stagnating living standards, stagnating productivity is in the West. I think none of us are ready for what that looks like politically, and that's not just the left; it's the right as well, right? Farage, even now, okay, Reform are polling really well, but what's Farage's his offer? Deficit-funded tax cuts, right? Which is basically, that's what the right has done for 40 years. We'll run a deficit to pay for tax cuts, principally for the rich. And we'll say we'll shrink the state, we'll make it slightly bigger, which that's what they've done for 40 years. So I think we really need to generate an alternative. And actually, being honest, I love the Labour manifesto in 2017, 2019. Fantastic. I wish they'd won, of course. But in the context of what I just said, demographic aging, climate change, automation, stagnant productivity, a lot of that stuff is quite antiquated. The programs and the assumptions of the 20th century are just that. They're from a different era.
Well, thank you both for joining me. My other hope and ambition for 2025 is I want to convince my partner to let us get a dog, but I think that's one thing.
Don't you already have a cat?
Yeah.
Actually, those Instagram videos where you see a dog
and a cat being best
and their friends. I love it.
Yeah, I love it. That's what I want. That's my hope and ambition, but I don't think it's going to happen. Aaron, Michael, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us as well.